Hello, this episode of Newscast is going to contain some distressing details because the main story we're covering today is the sentencing in Liverpool Crown Court on Thursday of Axel Rudakubana, who earlier this week pled guilty to 3 counts of murder when he attacked a Taylor Swift dance class in the town of Southport in July last year. The judge summed up some of the events of that day.
And over about 15 minutes, he savagely killed 3 of them and attempted to kill 8 more, as well as 2 adults who tried to stop him. It was of such extreme violence, of the utmost and exceptionally high seriousness, that it is difficult to comprehend why it was done. I am sure that Rudakubana had a settled and determined intention to carry out these offences, and that had he been able to, he would have killed each and every child, all 26 of them, as well as any adults who got in his way.
And listening to that in Liverpool was a couple of my BBC colleagues who we will catch up with on this episode of Newscast. Daniel Sandford is there. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Adam.
And Judith was inside monitoring every minute of it, so thank you very much for that, Judith.
Yeah, no problem.
Judith, I know you've been covering this story since the start, and it's been a very intense experience. Where do you want to kind of start with the story this evening?
I think intense is right, and it's actually, I suppose this is a moment for me to just stand back and think about the day, because it's been probably unlike almost any other court experience I've had, and I've been in a lot of different courtrooms. I've heard cases before of high emotion, of terrible loss. I think one of the things that was so difficult today was the level of detail that we heard, which I'm not now going to give to you, because it was so graphic, so upsetting, and also because the families of the children who are at the heart of all of this spoke to the media privately before, via their lawyers and via the police, before today's hearing, to request that reporters don't give the full detail of what we were going to hear in court. So we were in the courtroom, and in an annex I was in an adjacent courtroom watching the proceedings on a link, because there are so many journalists and members of the public and others who wanted to be present that they've had to use 3 courtrooms to accommodate us. But really my reporting, and I was blogging live during the proceedings for the BBC website, and whilst I was listening to the description that we were being given of what had happened that day, I was almost self-censoring and filtering what I was then blogging. And so I'm really, I suppose, standing now here talking to you and saying that we didn't broadcast and report the full extent of what was heard in court, and I don't think we ever will, actually. Safe to say that, it is one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever been present at in a court of law, and I'm sure that goes for many of the other people who were there today.
And Judith, just for people listening, that's because the level of frenzy of this attack, because the new details we got, mostly coming from the judge today, about actually what happened in that room that none of us actually saw.
Yeah, and actually, just to explain what we had today, was that the case, because there hasn't been a trial, because the defendant pleaded guilty, no need for a trial, it meant the prosecution hadn't opened the case against him. So they did that today. We had this morning several hours of listening to the lead prosecutor, Diana Here, KC, as she went through the chronology of what had happened during the attack and the detail, the terrible detail of what had happened to those children, including the pathology, the medical evidence, the detail of their injuries. That's what I'm saying when I tell you that it was a particularly graphic account. And so that happened first. We also today in the court heard from the people, some of the people most directly connected through victim impact statements, which are given on their behalf. So on but the parents of some of the children, and in one case even a teenager who had been present herself, who came and spoke to, via a video link, that spoke to camera to the judge directly about her experience that day. And so we could glean bits and pieces of information and emotion and background through that process. That really brought it, I think, fully into focus just the extent of how awful this has been, though those victim impact statements. And then after that, the judge, Mr. Justice Goose, passed sentence, and as you've just said, his comments as well add more detail to this. In addition to that, by the way, as part of these proceedings, the police and the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, in the last 24 hours have released material which would have been shown in the trial had it happened. It was shown today here in court, video, CCTV that we watched as reporters, along with others in the courtroom, with the lawyers and some of the family members who were there.
And Judith, I'll get you to expand on that in a second.
It's not all been released publicly because it's not, I should just say, it's not all been released publicly again because of the nature of some of it.
Yeah, and we'll go into some of the detail of that in a second. But Daniel, just with that main number for the sentence, a minimum of 52 years, just explain what the judge said about how he arrived at that number and some of the sort of the caveats around that figure.
Well, the judge was hamstrung by the legislation. The law says that you can't give what's called a whole life order, meaning somebody just can't be released from prison at all, to somebody who was under the age of 18 when they commit the crime. And you can only give it to someone between the age of 18 and 20 in very, very exceptional circumstances. Now, the reasons why you might give a whole life order are that you set about in a premeditated way to kill children, or you set about in a premeditated way to kill more than one person. Well, obviously Axel Rudakubana had done both. He set about in a premeditated way to kill more than one child. So he would have automatically qualified for a whole life order pretty much. And then add on top of that the ferocity of it, the attempted murders, the production of ricin. He would have been heading for a whole life order. The judge couldn't pass that. And the judge also couldn't take into account that this was a terrorist offence because it wasn't being viewed as a terrorist offence because it didn't have that political, religious or racial element. But the judge made it quite clear in his sentencing that even though it didn't have that terrorist element, he regarded it as serious as a terrorist crime. And he then passed a minimum term, a life sentence with a minimum term, meaning the first time that you can be considered for release, of 52 years. We've never seen anything like that for a teenager before. Hashim Abedi, the brother of the Manchester Arena bomber, got 55 years when he was under 21 at the time of the offence, but he wasn't a teenager. This is a man who, in most other crimes, would be considered as a youth in the court system, wouldn't be considered as an adult at all. So it was an exceedingly high sentence, but of course that matched the absolute horror of the crime, and the judge said that he believes actually Axel Rudakubana will never be released because he'll be 69 going on 70 when he's eligible for release, but then of course the parole board will actually have to agree that he could be released, which they might not given some of the things the judge said today. And also people don't live that long when they're in prison because they have unhealthy lifestyles, so it's not that often that someone who serves that amount of time in prison actually survives to come out.
And as we're recording this episode of Newscast, just after 6:30 on Thursday already, a request has been lodged with ministers, with the Attorney General to review that sentence in case it's considered to be too lenient. Judith, just going back to your point about the new details that we got today, there was a lot of them, and it seems to me you can sort of put them in three categories. There's stuff about Rudakubana's childhood and his early teens. There's stuff about what he was doing in the years and the months before this attack in Southport, and then there's the quite difficult details about the day itself, like the footage from inside the taxi he got to Southport to the dance class, and then the footage of him trying the different doors to get into the class.
Yeah, it's 6 months since that awful day in Southport. It's very fresh in my memory. I was there very shortly after this all happened, and it feels like no time, but actually in the intervening months there hasn't been, because there was the prospect of a trial, any real detail given publicly about everything that's happened, particularly, as you've just said, about the past, about the background to Axel Rudakubana, because of the need to protect that trial. Well, it's all come out to the extent now, really, that you can build a very close chronology, really starting pretty much from his childhood through for several years, it now turns out, before that awful day, through the times when we now know he had interactions with the police, times when he went in, he was expelled from his former high school and he went back there on one occasion with a knife. He didn't use it then. He attacked a child with a hockey stick. There's a past history of violence. We know that he was viewing all sorts of material online which interests in extreme violence, in wars, in genocide. This is material that the police found when they went to his house, that there were 3 referrals to the government's counter-terrorism prevent programme. All of this has emerged in recent days and through all of the agencies involved, who now are looking at whether they have questions to answer, and we know there'll be a public inquiry. A lot of that was laid out in court today. As you say, there was also all this information, the video we were shown of the day itself, of Rudakubana leaving his house, getting in a taxi, going to the scene. There's camera footage of him in the taxi, jumping out, refusing to pay the driver. Something that struck me actually is that you can see that as he walks up to the building, he walks in, he tries the wrong door, and then he finds the right door, or the door he wanted, and it's almost nonchalant the way he saunters through. That really struck me, that he just walks inside and up the stairs. And of course we know that there were 26 children up there. You watch the footage and it's just horrifying to think that he's on his way into the room. So all of that sort of information and material is now emerging and will continue, I think, in coming days to be coming out. And it's important to remember, that for the families of the children involved and for the survivors, for the adults, people like Leanne Lucas, the yoga teacher who was running the class, a lot of this information is new to them as well, because they could have been witnesses had this come to trial. They weren't therefore shown a lot of this material in advance because they needed to be able to give their own personal fresh accounts of what happened should they be called to court for that purpose. And so they will have been in court listening to this today or learning about it over the last day or so, and it's a lot for them to take in, a huge amount.
And Judith, I imagine it's been a lot for you as well, so we really appreciate your time today, especially when you've now got a few more hours of work to do as well, so thank you.
Thank you.
Daniel, if I can just pick your brains with your many, many years covering home affairs and terrorism, what's your take about this situation that we've got now, where the Crown Prosecution Service and the police didn't describe this as a terror-related incident initially, when actually in previous attacks and previous incidents, actually very quickly they got labelled as an act of terrorism? Just talk us through what's happened here.
So obviously we have been probing the police about this since July the 29th last year, and quite soon after July the 29th, senior officers that I was talking to were saying to me, we can't find a motivation, we can't work out what the ideology is behind this. He just seems to be wanting to kill children. That's what he seems to have set out to do that day. There's no sort of other ideological basis. And as we heard today, when Axel Rudakubana is in the police station after he's committed the crime, he's saying he's glad that children have died. He's saying that he's glad 6-year-old children have died. But he doesn't say anything about why he did it. He doesn't say anything about any religious cause or something. And so the truth is, police have not found any ideological reason. Maybe it'd be easier if they had, but they have not found any ideological reason why he did this. The motivation, as best as we can assess it, was that he wanted to cause outrage, to harm some of the most vulnerable people and kill some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And he spent some years sort of browsing around in some very, very violent places. High school massacres were definitely a part of what he was interested in. He was quite interested in some sort of colonial and stuff. He'd, for example, downloaded a document about the Mau Mau insurgency in colonial Kenya. He was quite interested in how punishments that had been given to slaves. So there was some interest in sort of that kind of colonial culture, but he was also interested in Chechnya, in Somalia. He didn't interest in the IRA. He had a fascination at school with Genghis Khan. He was interested in Adolf Hitler. He was obviously being of Rwandan heritage. He was interested in the Rwandan genocide of 1994. So he had this very broad interest. But one thing you can sum up is that in all of that, the interest was in mass murder and awful murders and awful violence. And that seems to have been what he'd honed in on. And under our current definition of terrorism, that isn't terrorism. That's just kind of evil. And there is a debate now, which is being pushed back, I should say, by many people involved in the world of counterterrorism. Should we broaden the definition of terrorism? And then there's a second debate, which is, well, if we're not going to broaden the definition of terrorism, what kind of structures do we need to create to deal with people like Axel Rudakubana? Because there are many more of them now. I mean, if you look at who was referred to the PREVENT programme in the last year, for which there are figures available, more than 30% of the people were people who didn't really appear to have any specific ideology, either a mixed ideology or no ideology. And that compares to, for example, 19% far right, 13% Islamist. So the biggest number in that were people who didn't really have an ideology. They were just doing things that were concerning education providers because they were of an interest in violence or some other kind of extremism. So I think it's obviously for the public inquiry to kind of wrestle with, but it might be that the conclusion is, well, you kind of let prevent and counter terrorism get on with what they do and maybe create some other kind of structures for dealing with really troublesome kids. I think what bothers me in this case, and Jonathan Hall Casey, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, has kind of highlighted this quite well this week, is that of course it's right that specialist counter-terrorist police and specialist counter-terrorism de-radicalisers shouldn't be kind of just dealing with bad people. They have a specific role and they've got some very specific relationships with people like MI5 and the security service and so on. But that doesn't mean you can just leave these people alone and not worry about them. What happened here was that when there were concerns, they were raised with Prevent. Prevent said, well, it's not for us. Lancashire Constabulary, for example, found him on a bus with a knife a couple of years before he carried out these murders, but just went home and said to the parents, listen, you might want to put the knives away at home, keep the knives away. Mental health were heavily involved, but nobody had either identified the risk, or if they had identified the risk, they didn't really know what to do. What do we do with him? And if he's not a one-off, if he's not unique, but actually there's growing numbers of people who potentially could turn into Axel Rudakubana, you've got to do something about that. And previous horrendous crimes, I often think of the Dunblane shooting of 1996, if those need to have that led to the handgun ban in the UK. If you need landmark cases lead to something, then yes, you can deal with knives a bit, as the government's discussed this week. You can deal with Prevent a bit potentially. The public inquiry may come up with other things, but there's two bits that are really worrying about this case. One is his age and how quickly and how deep he descended into an obsession with violence. And the other is, of course, what the Prime Minister spoke about on Tuesday. Where's it all coming from? The internet and the online world. And that just is still the absolute Wild West. And it comes up again and again, doesn't it? It comes up in issues around children being encouraged to commit suicide, in the issues around child sexual abuse imagery, and in this case, just sort of obsession with violence. And I can see that's where the Prime Minister's going. What are we going to do about the internet? But, we've just had the Online Safety Act passed, and that really didn't do anything that could handle this.
I think for me, in sort of public policy terms, it boils down to two things. And I mean, you explained it really well there, but just sort of my like brief summary of that is that we've got a thing called terrorism, which doesn't include somebody who just wants to terrorize the public. So there's an issue there. And then we live in a world where one week all the news is people accusing the police of being too heavy-handed and investigating these non-crime hate incidents, which is almost criminalising free speech. But then we have an example here where there are multiple opportunities missed to stop somebody who went on to commit a terrible atrocity. And actually, politics and society and democracy is about balancing all those things and trying to get it as right as you can.
Yeah, and listen, we have, in Britain, we have got a history of mass murderers. It's not something that's unheard of. And, it goes back to things like Dunblane. These are things that have happened before outside of the terrorism context. But I think you just want to make sure that this can be a unique case and it can just never happen again. But you want to make sure that you're building as much protection as you can for a society. And I spent a lot of time picking up bits and pieces over the last 6 months about this case, and then what was a trickle became a bit more of a flood in the week before he pleaded guilty. And then obviously we have had a flood since he pleaded guilty, and we now have a very, very clear idea of this trajectory from just a normal kid in primary school and the beginning of secondary school to being a kid who probably as a result of bullying initially phones Childline, says I'm going to take a knife to school, is found with a knife at school, goes back and attacks a kid with a hockey stick who, by the way, had nothing to do with any of the bullying, just some innocent kid carrying a knife at school. And then everybody knows there's a problem. Everyone can see, and they're worried that he's becoming isolated. They're worried he's not in education. He's carrying a knife sometimes. His parents are worried about the parcels are being delivered to the next door neighbours. Mental health involved, and the police keep referring him back into the sort of children's services section of Lancashire. And I guess there are many kids out there like that who don't turn into Axel Rudakubana. But have we got the right protective structures built for that? And clearly in this case we didn't. Maybe it doesn't matter if it's a one-off, but what if it isn't?
Daniel, thank you so much, and thanks for bringing all those years of experience to your analysis there as well. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam. Cheers.
Right. Now, I hope you don't mind that we focus so much on kind of the story and the details and the policy implications of that story, because that's the thing that you can do as a journalist, where you can feel that you're making a bit of a difference and helping you to understand what's going on. The much harder thing to do is to just find a way to sort of commemorate the people who lost their lives in Southport, the 3 little girls. That's a much harder thing to do as a journalist. And maybe that's why we sort of shy away a bit from doing that. But I'll just end this bit of newscast by saying that today everyone is thinking about the families of Elsie Stankham, aged 7, Alice De Silva Aguiar, aged 9, and BB King, aged 6. Right, let's have a massive, massive change of vibe now, because one of the other things that's happening in the world at the moment is the World Economic Forum, which is that gathering of big CEOs of businesses and big world leaders in the Swiss ski resort of Davos. Some years it looks like kind of jolly for rich people and business journalists, but some years the news just comes tumbling down that mountaintop. And this is one of those years. And luckily, Faisal Islam, BBC business editor, is there to catch all the news as it comes rolling down the mountainside. Hello, Faisal.
Hi, Adam. How you doing?
Good, thanks. I won't ask if you've had time to go skiing yet up that Swiss mountain, because actually you've been doing a lot of reporting, because this year's World Economic Forum has had a lot of news stories.
Oh, it absolutely has. And I suppose it's no coincidence that this was sort of the same time as inauguration, but we thought that might take the attention away. But in a sort of strange way, it's become the alternative pole of the world to what's happening in DC. And every morning, people awake, and yet they talk about what's happening in the panels here. There's some pretty important world leaders, financiers, and corporate leaders, and then try and work out what's happening in Washington, try and discern from what we get from the executive orders or from speeches, exactly what Donald Trump's designs on the world economy are. And then just now, about 10 minutes ago it finished, those two worlds kind of collided, a little bit like in Ghostbusters, where the lines cross, and there was something of a nuclear explosion, I would say, an extremely consequential speech from Donald Trump that I think sets the terms, you might say the terms of trade for the entire world economy for the next 4 years at least. And it's a very different world we appear to be heading into.
Yeah, and we're recording this bit of this episode of Newscast at 5:30 on Thursday. I mean, it's always very hard with a Donald Trump speech to say, give us the headlines, because there's always about, or certainly at the moment, there's about 10 or 15 headlines. But what were the key bits that you'd pick out for us? Or maybe it was just like the inauguration speech again, but just to a different audience.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. Even that was quite extraordinary to see this different audience, one that's been used to sort of banging the drum for climate change, for diversity initiatives, for saving the planet at the same time as making lots of money, trying to find a balance. That's the sort of vibe of this place. But actually facing the reality that at the top tree of the world economy and world power, that narrative is changing hugely. So that's one thing. But then there was a very direct, specific move he made, which I think there was no coincidence. It was targeted, it was aimed at the voices in that room that I was in too. It was to say to those global executives that you face a choice. It is your prerogative, Donald Trump said. You can either be attracted to the USA, move your production, your factories to the USA and enjoy lots of lovely tax breaks to do so, or your choice, stay in your own countries and try and export to my country, and you will pay a tariff worth not hundreds of billions of dollars, but trillions of dollars.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay down debt. Under the Trump administration, there will be no better place on earth to create jobs, build factories, or grow a company than right here in the good old USA.
Now, obviously, we make some excuse here for some hyperbole, but in the context is, at the beginning of the week, there was some relief here that he didn't announce massive day one tariffs, and that underlined a certain degree of relative optimism. Things weren't as bad as they could be in terms of the global trading system. But actually, what he's just said then, there's only really one way, well, there's two ways of reading it. Either he really is going to levy a universal tariff against all imports of a massive proportion, or this is a menacing threat designed to get into the heads of global executives so that they do move their production to the USA. And I've never seen anything like that. So an extraordinary set of rhetoric. It was in its own way quite charming as well, I have to say, and you could see the audience being charmed. I'll see you there next year, he said, cracking some jokes, some laughs. But there were also gasps, I think, of horror when he said what he has said previously to US audience, which is Canada's ripping us off, I'm going to eradicate the deficit. Perhaps one way to do that is for Canada to essentially join the United States. There were gasps at that point. I don't think we've seen these two worlds collide quite like we saw just in that room via that video address.
And then when we talk about the Russia-Ukraine war, on yesterday's episode of Newscast, I was chatting to James Landale about Trump's first social media post about the Ukraine conflict, which actually didn't mention Ukraine at all. It was all focused on Russia and the Russian economy. And it seems today Donald Trump has doubled down on Ukraine and Russia as an economic thing, or economic solutions to bring that war to an end, rather than military or diplomatic solutions.
Yeah, Adam, I'm really glad you noticed that, because actually, if you look at the numbers on the Russian economy, there is some sign now that, unlike the past 12 months, the Russian economy is being hit and starting to hurt from these sanctions. You cannot run a war economy for so long. You're just going to generate inflation. And the Trump administration appears to have spotted this. And they seem to think that there's an economic solution to the war. More than that, actually, in a slightly separate point he was making about bringing down the oil price so that Americans in their cars could benefit from low petrol prices, he also said that if the Saudis help bring down the oil price, that could help bring an end to the war. That's because it would wreck the Russian budget and undermine their war budget. So that's an interesting, quite sophisticated argument, one with some merit, I would say, given where the Russian economy is. But he sees both an economic and a diplomatic angle on ending that war in Ukraine.
Right, let's get really parochial now and talk about the little old EU. Only 460 million people, but seeming quite small compared to the things we've just been talking about there. You had a little scoop on Thursday morning from chatting to Maros Sefcovic, who is the EU Trade Commissioner, but in his previous job, he was the man that overseed the UK-EU relationship. And he put some interesting feelers out, didn't he?
Yeah, he did, and I was, trying to get him to respond. There's something of a sort of phony war going on, where I think, in terms of the UK-EU relationship, there is a desire on both sides to do more and to bring down some of the barriers that were created by the Boris Johnson deal, a distant deal that raised tariff barriers. Now, there are various options. I think top of the tree is a veterinary agreement, but there's a decision to be made about how full fat that is. Do you go for the New Zealand option, which is quite thin, and you just get a few of those barriers, you get fewer checks, basically, or do you go full fat, Swiss deal, and then eradicate lots of those barriers to food and farm exports that could have a big impact to farmers? They're not very happy with the government for various reasons right now. I get the sense that there's a lot of ambition, more ambition than perhaps is realised in Westminster in these talks. But there's a quid pro quo here. If they're to go for that, and Maros Sefcovic said this to me, we're willing to have a talk about it, and that would involve it would involve dynamic alignment. So that is keeping up with the EU rules in real time as they change so that no checks are required. That could prove controversial if we're operating by the rules of the past 6 or 7 years, but maybe, given all the growth narrative we're hearing, maybe the government, the cabinet are starting to think, do you know what, we can push this. This is good for the growth of the economy. It's good to bring down barriers. And there was another issue, and that was a specific issue that caused some action, I'd say, in the lobby in Westminster, which was he also lent into, to be fair, I suggested to him, because I've heard it from British business, that a customs arrangement, you've covered this in Brexitcasts of old, around the rules of origin, which is qualifying for the free trade agreement. Well, it turns out that when you do that trade between the UK and the EU, there are still billions of pounds of tariffs being paid because the parts, the ingredients that go into these goods, they're not always from the European area. They might be from a wider area, countries like Turkey, North Africa, the EFTA nations. And so there is an arrangement called the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Accumulation Area, which is definitely not a customs union. That's definitely what the government's saying, and it isn't, that's true. But it sort of is a little bit of a stepping stone, and he said he could consider that. And we've heard that from Europe before, but I think it crystallised a bit of chat, and you heard back in London, well, there was they went one way and t'other, but it does seem as if they're leaving open that option. They're not ruling it out. It's being talked about. It's being pushed by some businesses, but not all. And so I think it's on the table. I don't think it's wildly important in and of itself, but as a symbol of how ambitious this Brexit reset might be, I think it is quite significant against the backdrop of other sort of pro-growth gambles or risks or decisions we're hearing from the government over here.
But Faisal, you gave me such a treat this morning because the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention, I then scratched my head and went back into the deepest recesses of my brain to remember what that actually was. And you spelled it out there, but it's this thing called diagonal accumulation, isn't it? Where if you've got a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU,
showing off now.
Yeah, the EU, if it decides something is coming from the UK and therefore has no tariffs on it, it has to be satisfied that that's a UK-made product. And actually, if the British product is just made up of components from other countries, the EU might be tempted to treat that product as actually from those countries rather than from the UK and give it tax treatment accordingly. So the PEM would get rid of that for a whole load of countries around the Mediterranean, so the UK could put Turkish and Egyptian components into its products and then send it to the EU as if it was all British. And also just to remind people, when we talk about the veterinary agreement, we're not talking about free movement on skiing holidays for vets. We're talking about plants and animal checks, which is really important for livestock or the seafood industry or lovely cheese products going from, I don't know, Lancashire to the south of France. Now, just to get really, really British then, Rachel Reeves seems like she's been a bit hyperactive there. Every time she does an interview, whether it's with the BBC or Bloomberg, the news agency, she announces a new government policy related to growth.
Absolutely. There's been a slew of policies designed to show some action on growth. And I think it's fair to say that in the first 6 months of this administration, we've heard a lot about a mission on growth. We've heard a lot about stability and foundations, and it was reasonable. Some of this was what we saw in the markets in the first week or so of the year, to say, well, where's the actual growth coming from? Actual growth is flat at the moment. What risks are you taking? You've got a majority of 170. Are you actually going to face any pain in order to get the growth? Because that is perhaps what investors want to hear. Are you going to stand by them as they want to build data centers and pylons and wind turbines? So they have a series of policies, frankly, from visas to a lean into the runway issue to this issue about non-DOMs too. So slightly weakening the non-DOM arrangements. But I'm starting to see the outlines of a strategy. We're going to get a trade strategy and an industrial strategy soon, but I think the strategy is this, which is post-Brexit, we've got freedom to go elsewhere in the world, and they want to lean into that in the services. So AI, tech, pharmaceuticals, and Trump makes a difference there because he's going to deregulate. Maybe we will deregulate in that vein, but maybe we'll also benefit from those people that don't like the Trump regulation of the pharmaceutical industry. Big sign, come to Britain, that type of thing. But in goods, where they have been hit by the post-Brexit, sort of hard Brexit, clean Brexit, non-tariff barriers type approach, they're going to try and lower barriers. So that's where I think they're going. I might have a person quite quickly who might be able to tell me some of the details on that, because I should be able to speak to on other outlets for a member of the cabinet who's here. But yeah, I see the outlines of a strategy. And then more widely, everything is about getting investors to know the government is willing to change some of the laws and regulations in order to get those a little bit of the massive pot of global investment in infrastructure and things like artificial intelligence.
And Faisal is very diplomatically wrapping up there, because I think Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, has just turned up right where he's standing so Faisal can chat to him and ditch me. But it's okay, happy to be ditched for the cabinet. Thanks, Faisal. Have a good rest of the summit.
Definitely ditched. You're dumped. Bye.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much to everyone who's been on it, and thank you to you too for listening, especially when some of the details we were discussing were so distressing. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.